Welcome to our podcast. My name is Keely Severson, and I'm here with my co-hosts Eric Johnson and Alicia Swami. And today we are interviewing Michael Lawler. Welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us. You wrote an interesting paper that we want to discuss with you on fungal shrapnel found in the atmosphere. Tell us more, Michael.
Sure, yeah. That phrase had some lasting power. So basically I'm an atmospheric scientist and aerosol researcher. And so basically we go to different locations and try to understand how particles form in the atmosphere of different sorts. And so basically we're sampling over some fields in Oklahoma and identified something we hadn't seen before. We saw new signals in the mass spectrometer that we weren't familiar with, and it turned out that they were fungal parts. So we identified chitin, which is sort of the structural polysaccharide biopolymer that makes up the cell walls of, for example, fungal spores, and these sort of sugar alcohols like mannitol that are sort of part of the goop of the inside of the fungal spores. And so the surprise was basically, we're kind of, the perspective we're coming from is, I'm looking at something we call new particle formation in the atmosphere, where particles will form out of gas phase species. So gases will condense, form a nucleus, and then grow to a particle of thousands or millions of molecules. So that's what we were looking for. So these really the small particles we identified on a scale of tens of nanometers, so thousands and thousands of times smaller, narrower than a human hair. We expected that sort of particle down there, but what we found were these little bits of fungus. This fungal shrapnel, apparently from large intact spores, which are on the size of microns, so 1,000 times larger, that had broken up in the atmosphere to form these small bits, which we identified as the main gist of the work.
Why did you call it fungal shrapnel?
I thought it sounded memorable because it's almost certainly from bursting. So so when these spores get released into the atmosphere, changes in atmospheric conditions appear to be able to explode them. So like basically, if you get the relative humidity goes up, it's called osmotic bursting. So basically, you have this really solute rich solution inside the cells, and so there's an osmotic pressure that the water from the atmosphere wants to get in there and basically fill up that volume with more water, and then it at some point it can rupture the cell wall, and then they explode. So they're like little mini fungal explosions.
Yeah, it sounds like your choice of words really conveys a sense of pathogenesis here, that you attach some really savage importance to this kind of process.
I hesitate to speculate on the pathogenicity at this point. So what we know is, as far as the identity of these particles, is that they were fungus. So that's about the extent of it. So there's not that many other materials that have both that chitin bit and the sugar alcohols that sort of clued us in that that's what it was. If it were more plant matter, we might expect something more like cellulose as a structural bit. And the fact that it had, similar bursting events had been seen in the Amazon, and researchers looking at larger particles had speculated that those bursts of little particles could come from fungus, because they know they can take fungal cells on the microscope slide and expose them to high RH and explode them. So they know that they can burst. But our study essentially identified that, yes, that's really what these little bits of material are in the atmosphere sometimes, is broken up fungus. But we don't know anything about the genera or species or any other compounds that might be present in there. Whether this is something that has mycotoxins or not, the particular species that burst, we don't know. From our study, we didn't have that kind of precision or ability to detect those sort of trace components of the fungus.
Well, it sounds like this dovetails perfectly with Kawasaki's disease. One of the peculiar observations about this strange disease in Japan, typically among children, where they have this horrific immunological response to some unknown agent. They've narrowed it down a little bit, but the main thing they've discovered was that Kawasaki's disease is associated with dust clouds from China. And yet it's where the dust settles, not where it originates, that this immunological response to Candida species has been observed. Have any Kawasaki's disease researchers contacted you?
No, not yet. That's the first I've heard of Kawasaki's disease.
The famous virus hunter, Dr. Ian Lipkin, took note of that. How peculiar it is that this immunological response is where the atmosphere, the dust, these particulates settle, but not where they originate.
That's interesting. So the suggestion is there's some sort of atmospheric aging process that matters for generating this immunological response.
Yeah, some sort of nucleation process in the upper atmosphere that turns something that is a macromolecule into a nanoparticle.
Well, let me think about that. So what is it a presumably some sort of protein that is the actual agent that affects people immunologically?
They haven't narrowed it
Is
down
that known?
yet. They've said that it's associated with some kind of products from yeast and smuts and Candida. So they got as far as saying that it's fungal in nature, but they don't know if it's proteins or the structure or the beta glucans or what. But it's just incredibly amazing that you wouldn't have the disease where this substance emanates from, and it isn't until it goes through the upper atmosphere and then falls on Japan that it creates this type of illness.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know if I would jump to a nucleation process necessarily. I mean, I could imagine also like oxidation in the atmosphere could break down parts of the organisms, release what's in there. Yeah.
Well, it does seem to be associated with the shift from macromolecules to nanoparticle size, but beyond that, we're not quite sure what's going on.
So the macromolecules are present as part of the structure of the organism, right? They're in there already. So so the nanoparticles, I guess you're thinking are somewhat larger than the macromolecules.
I'm thinking that the macromolecules, the bundles and clusters and aggregates, the fragments, the spores that are all going up into the atmosphere are somehow breaking down and descending in a more pathogenic nanoparticle form, which can go deeper into the lungs, into the blood, and even penetrate the blood-brain barrier.
Okay, yeah, I guess when I think of macromolecules on like a similar scale to nanoparticles size-wise. I'd say like large particle like organism fragments could break down into nanoparticles. Yeah, I think that's yeah, definitely a possibility. I think they show that for the this idea of like the thunderstorm asthma, that
Yes.
this is you bring particles up, they're exposed to higher RH conditions where they're more likely to rupture, and then you can have a downdraft where you have these ruptured smaller bits that might be generate more of an allergic or pathogenic response. So
Yeah,
something.
the antigens in thunderstorm asthma, they go, well, we know what it is, and yet why doesn't it cause the same kind of illness until after it goes through the thunderstorm process?
Right. Yeah. The breaking up process is definitely if you have, a single several micron size spore. I mean, you can break that up into thousands of nanoparticles. I think I just read an estimate about maybe like on the order of 1,000 droplets for the breakup of a pollen, as an example. I think I read that today. So yeah, I mean, a couple orders of magnitude more particles, and that are smaller, that could potentially penetrate deeper into the lungs. So that is definitely plausible that processing is important to generate some of these responses. I think that makes sense.
And yet, even with the reduction down to nanoparticle size, the pathogenesis is so striking. I mean, the immunological reaction, like comparable to a Stevens-Johnson reaction. So the immune system goes absolutely ballistic for reasons unknown. And now I'm not a chemist, but I've read a little bit and I've got a bit of an imagination. And I've been reading about chemical conversions with a halogenated alkane reaction, substitution reaction, where you can actually add an atom to an existing molecular structure and completely alter its pathogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
So is it
Yeah,
possible that in the upper atmosphere, the combination of ultraviolet light and the chemical reactions that are taking place in that milieu are somehow causing this kind of substitution reaction process?
it's not crazy. Yeah, I mean, biological biogenic molecules that get into the atmosphere are almost certainly going to be oxidized. They're in a more reduced form in your body, in general, and then the atmosphere is an oxidizing environment, whether it's OH radical formed from water vapor and ozone, or whether it's a chlorine radical formed from chlorine in the upper atmosphere. Given enough time, if a biogenic molecule persists in the atmosphere, it's going to be oxidized. The extent to which it's going to get substituted, if you're going to get like halogens like chlorine adding in, that depends, versus just breaking it up into smaller molecules, that depends on the structure, the bond structure. But yeah, of course, every molecule that, if it's exposed to atmospheric oxidants, is going to be oxidized in the atmosphere over time. So they can certainly undergo changes. The question is just whether what's most likely, that they break down into smaller bits that may be less harmful, or that something else adds on that initiates some new biological effect when it contacts somebody. Both seem possible, depending on the molecule.
Nanopathology suggests that the reducing down to that scale can make a molecule far more harmful, because it has a surface energy that allows it to penetrate the defenses in our lungs, actually go right through the blood, and somehow escape all the mechanisms we have to remove this and eventually get into the brain.
Yeah, right. Those yeah, the nanoparticles have fascinating properties. Yeah.
Yeah, your article really caught my attention because I've been fascinated by the idea of something going up into the atmosphere and then coming down more pathogenic ever since the 1985 Lake Tahoe mystery illness, which you know today by another name, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Hmm.
Because a whole bunch of us got sick at Lake Tahoe in 1985, and we had some kind of immune suppression. Viral infections lit up like crazy. This resulted in the overt manifestation of EBV reactivation, which nearly everybody has. But they never could figure out why a whole town or an entire region would suddenly have problems controlling the common kissing disease, Epstein-Barr virus.
Hmm.
What happened at the time that the pollution cloud from the San Joaquin Valley, an agricultural region just upwind, was
That's where I'm from.
well, that brown cloud was getting a little bit higher every year. And we'd go up hiking on Donner Summit. We'd look down at all the poor people down in the San Joaquin and go, oh boy, I feel
It's a
sorry for
soup.
you guys
Yeah.
having to breathe that crap.
Yeah, it can get really bad.
And I actually thought the day that that cloud comes up and ruins Lake Tahoe, there's going to be riots. People are going to go ballistic. I mean, up here, you look across the length of the lake and see the mountains 40, 50 miles away, green trees. I mean, just the air was so clear and pure. And that changed relatively quickly. Just in the 1985 period, the brown cloud finally crested the mountains and filled up the Lake Tahoe basin. And that's when we started having an algal bloom. All of the buildings that had toxic mold, the sick buildings that affected people a little bit, now made people violently ill. And the only common denominator that I could see was that the uplift, the orographic lift by the shape of the mountains, forcing that brown cloud to a specific elevation and then dropping back down on us, somehow influenced the pathogenesis of the molecules in such a way that the sick buildings were worse and the algal bloom produced toxins that were like we'd never seen before.
I guess my read of those observations my hypothesis would be, yes, like bringing in that pollution from the valley. I mean, if you're susceptible to any sort of lung issues, I mean, you're putting a bigger impact on yourself if you have these, like, small PM. I would be hesitant to attribute any algal blooms to it, because I don't think that there's that. Yeah, I would be more inclined to say, to point to
I've only seen one study so
population
far,
growth or change around the growth.
but somebody actually did a study where they tried exposing algal bloom cyanobacteria to nanoparticles, and it grew more luxuriantly and put out more toxins.
Huh. That's interesting.
So this is all pretty groundbreaking stuff.
Make a note of that.
Do you know Professor Anthony Wexler from UC Davis?
Not personally, but somewhat familiar with their work.
His work is pretty, it sounds like fun. He's got a van that he's got loaded with sensors that are very accurate, that can detect nanoparticles. And he drives his van all over the place looking for nanoplumes.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
That's pretty cool. So he goes all over California, all over the place with this van, and he finds these nanoplumes, and he doesn't know what the source is. What's producing these nanoparticles? Why is there such a high concentration in certain areas? I mean, you can actually trace it by doing a grid pattern down to where the source is, so you can find the location pretty easily. That's very simple. But what's producing them? That remains a mystery. Well, I read years ago that if fungi are exposed to the constituent elements, certain metals, the base substances of certain types of human-produced pollution, they can produce nanoparticles. For instance, aspergillus is very good at producing silver nanoparticles. They can actually use it in the production of silver nanoparticles.
Huh.
So it seemed to me that fungi were an extremely good suspect as a source point for nanoplumes.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, I will say that sort of default, the default view on seeing nanoscale particles in the atmosphere, so like less than 100 nanometers, is that they formed out of oxidation of gas phase molecules and nucleation of small particles into bigger particles, you know, from things like sulfuric acid, ammonia, from reacted organics that come from trees, or even from you know, anthropogenic sources. So I haven't read the Wexler papers that talk about this, but I think that's the default view, is that if you see these really small particles that probably came from molecules, weren't from the breakdown of larger, for example, biological particles into smaller particles. That was one of the new things about our paper, is that in general in the atmosphere, people think of particles as growing. So it's unusual when you identify particles that are really small, that didn't grow up from small sizes. That's kind of new thinking. So I think for me, it's still open how frequent that sort of thing is, that you could break down particles, for example, from larger biological particles. But the production of nanoparticles out of the gas phase, out of molecules, individual molecules, is well documented. And I've been involved in this work for several years, and people have been doing this for a couple decades, and that science is fairly well established now, at least, that happens. But are there other pathways to make nanoscale particles in the atmosphere that we're still discovering? I think our paper shows yes. So I think that area is still open. How frequent that sort of thing occurs.
Well, when I put your information together with mine and the observation of Kawasaki's disease and thunderstorm asthma, it seems like it's a possibility that nanoparticle production from fungi is being lofted by these storms, goes through some kind of conversion, some kind of process where they come down more pathogenic than when they went up.
Well, for that, I would point purely to the size change. That's the easiest explanation to me, is like big spores go up into the clouds, break down into small bits, and then the small bits have more of a pathogenic effect. To me, that's the most straightforward hypothesis, is that the breakdown is what's doing it. But I think it's also possible that you have reactions occurring.
Yeah, well, it's the default view of nucleation is aggregation, the increase in size, but all of a sudden we're seeing a different process, a reduction in size, and we look around for a process, something that might possibly do that. Well, the association with the uplift suggests tribostatic friction, a triboelectric action of all these molecules at high speed bumping off each other, producing a little electricity, lightning essentially, and being subjected to the atmospheric differential of the intense amount of electricity generated by the uplift of the air. And maybe this plays into what's breaking these down to nano size.
I did see that in the paper today when I was preparing for this meeting, that yeah, the apparently lightning may have an influence and may have a role to play in the breakup of particles in the atmosphere. I didn't know that before today. It's interesting.
Well, I've got a lot of really bizarre clues that I've been putting together for a long time. And one of them is the reaction that people with myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome have to change in the weather. Alterations in the weather. There's something about the weather that just absolutely knocks certain disease entities flat. And a lot of times this is attributed to barometric pressure. People say, well, it's the change in the atmospheric pressure on the organs. But that never made sense to me, because we go through changes of atmospheric pressure all the time. In a plane, going up and down a hill in a car. In fact, a lot of these barometric changes that we go through routinely are actually larger than what people complain about when a storm is coming. So maybe what they're overlooking is that the barometric pressure was just something that went along with the package, but it's really the electrical activity of the atmosphere that's creating this effect.
Yeah, whether it's the electrical aspect or the uplift and cooling and RH increasing, yeah, I would definitely point more to the weather that's associated with the change in the barometric pressure or the atmospheric motions than to squishing the organs. Not a biologist, but that would be my
it just
intuitive sense too.
I mean, it sounds more reasonable than just a change in air. You know, it's like they also attribute it to humidity. And yet we know, well, you don't get sick every time you jump in the shower. So it's probably not the humidity per se.
Right, yeah, it's a combination of things. So you make, right, you have some sort of combination of elements that it's hard to you can't isolate them, or if you do isolate them, you don't see the effects. But when you have the common elements together, be it, high RH, thunderstorm, rain, maybe the right season, at least in the case of Oklahoma, there's definitely a seasonality to these release of biological particles from the surface. So yeah, once you have all those ingredients together, then that's what gives you an effect.
At least we can see by this discussion that to understand a phenomenon like Kawasaki's disease, one has to know more than just it's an illness in Japan. You have to know how it moves. You have to know that where it came from, the substance involved with what appears to be the causative agent didn't create that kind of effect where it came from, but rather where it settled after going through the upper atmosphere.
Yeah, I'm gonna read about that after we talk. That's very interesting.
Fantastic. So yeah, I mean, putting these clues together, it's amazing. It's fun. And it's like with Professor Wexler's work on nanoplumes in California. Wouldn't it be cool to isolate the source points, go to where we know these plumes are coming from, take samples, and see if we can't find nanoparticle production or increased nanoparticle production in microbial colonies?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, so for that may be that you have an increase. Imagine that you found that. I mean, imagine that you discovered that if you have, like, for some reason, maybe you have a bloom of a microbial bloom somewhere. Maybe there's a natural lake, or for some reason you have a huge increase in I don't know whether it's plankton or the bacteria, something grows a lot. And then you associate it with an increase in nanoparticle formation in the atmosphere. So you have you still have the two pathways to think about. One is it that they released a bunch of gas phase volatile organic compounds that were oxidized in the atmosphere and went the traditional route, formed small particles, maybe with a combination of some pollution or other things that are present in the atmosphere, and grew particles up. And then those particles are going to have a certain composition. It can be a lot of oxidized, a lot of oxygen, organic molecules, probably no biogenic toxins or anything like that. It's just going to be stuff that was chewed up in the atmosphere and belonged together. Not to say that they couldn't be irritating to someone who breathes them, because they're small particles and they can leave your lungs, and they may still have an effect in there. But then the other pathway that you're looking at as well is there also the release of some biological particles that are larger, that then are broken down in the atmosphere to small particles, in which case on that pathway, maybe you do actually have real biogenic molecules in there. So if there are toxins or toxic molecules that are present as part of those original biological particles, then they might be in there, and if you breathe them in, that'll have its own effect. So I see two, even observing that, I would see two possible pathways with two inferences about what sorts of materials are actually going to be in those particles. They'll be different for sure.
But at least knowing about the mechanism, there's a starting point for further research. We have an idea what we're looking for.
Yeah, no, if that would be, it's always interesting to find. I mean, so we're, other work that I've been involved in is looking at particle formation over the oceans. And so there's definitely evidence that the first pathway that I mentioned occurs, that you have, if you have a strong biological production, there are some compounds that ultimately come out of plankton, plants, floating microscopic plants in the ocean that do lead to particle formation. So in the sort of anthropogenic urban atmosphere, a lot of particle formation comes from sulfuric acid. So we burn things, sulfur dioxide comes out. When you oxidize sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, it turns into sulfuric acid, which is highly condensable. It doesn't want to be a gas. It wants to condense in the particle phase. And interestingly, over the ocean, there's kind of a similar pathway. It's not from burning stuff, but it's from the release of this compound called dimethyl sulfide, among other sulfur-containing compounds. But it's another pathway for sulfur to get in the atmosphere, oxidizes and makes sulfuric acid, which can condense. It wants to be in the sort of particle phase and form new particles. So they're definitely, and that production is it's from, the dimethyl sulfide comes from biogenic sources. So it's a pathway that we know about over the ocean, that you produce small particles from biological activity and release of trace gases. So the extent to which that happens from like microbes in other locations, I don't know if we know much about that over the land surface, I would say, or lakes.
I take it you're a great fan of the London fog, the Great London Fog incident.
Fan, I mean, yeah, we certainly learned about that. Sounds like a
why
bummer.
was it so pathogenic? I mean, for a short time, it was absolutely deadly.
Oh, that I don't know.
So they attribute the London fog, the incident where so many people, thousands of people died, to sulfuric acid formation, an inversion effect, where somehow the atmospheric conditions were just right to concentrate all the particulates and create this sulfuric acid soup. But why
Okay.
did it happen so viciously? And why hasn't it happened on anything like that scale since?
Well, I mean, our fuels aren't perfect now, but we're using less sulfur than we were back then. I suppose, I don't know when this occurred. I mean, I was thinking just about London fog, smog
Oh,
in general, but
yeah, there was a famous event where all the conditions really conspired to cause. Uh, in fact, I can't remember when it was. It was a long time ago, um, but it actually influenced a reduction in coal burning because they go, wow,
mm-hmm,
we've got to do something here. We're going to all be so sick that London will be uninhabitable.
mm-hmm.
But that
Yeah, I
was
mean,
just,
yeah, I mean, we're using way less sulfur now in fuels than we have in the past.
so I guess we can cut this out if we need to. But one other thing that's been bugging me is people talk about chemtrails. The idea that evil conspirators are flying airplanes around, leaving white clouds of toxic killer substances to depopulate the planet to make it a utopia for the survivors.
Or pick your particular goal, but yes.
Uh, yeah, it's like that seems a bit far fetched. First of all, it'd be very difficult to get away with it. I mean, hiding stuff inside airplanes is not easy.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many problems with that. It's like, where do you even start? It's like you want to make someone sick, and instead of putting like some poison in their drink, it's like spritzing it 1,000 kilometers away from them and letting it disperse into the atmosphere, and then that's going to get them. It's preposterous. I mean, how many molecules do you think you could get down here to a single person from a aircraft?
It's like
It
you
would
say,
have to be the
there's so many problems with that theory. It's like, why do people go there? Especially if there's a easy explanation to mind. Yeah, the contrails are lingering longer than they used to. My grandfather, when World War II, when they were first developing aircraft bombers, propeller-driven aircraft, that could reach an altitude where they could create these kind of trails, these contrails. Doesn't have to be a jet. A turboprop can do it. Well, these were so amazing that people were fascinated at planes leaving a white cloud in the sky. And he was out there taking pictures. But these things, they didn't typically last for a long time. They dissipated fairly quickly. And they did seem to act differently than today, where a plane goes by and it will form a cloud that drifts off. I mean, it disperses and it blanks out the entire sky. So isn't it possible that what we're seeing here is simply altered effects of nucleation by the different kinds of particles that we put into the atmosphere?
I mean, I'd say the controls on when there are going to be contrails or not are pretty much, I mean, the particles they're forming on are what are the exhaust from the aircraft. I mean, I think that what other background particles may be around are way less important than the particles that are actually being delivered by the aircraft from combustion to the atmosphere right then. I think that the droplets are forming on those particles. And whether those have changed in composition much over the years, I mean, certainly I can imagine jet engines have changed in their efficiency over the past several decades, and it might change the size of the particles. You know, bigger particles, it's easier to get water to condense on them. Small particles, it's more difficult. So changes like that could have an effect. But really a huge effect is just the atmospheric conditions on a given day. I mean, for a given aircraft flying on a day where you have like just a little bit more water vapor in the air, you could have a contrail versus not a contrail. So I mean, you'll see sometimes big jetliners, ooh, big old contrail. Sometimes you'll see a big jet, at least here in Colorado, where it's, you know, it's pretty dry sometimes. You'll see those jetliners fly by and not make a contrail. So it depends. The
Yeah,
atmospheric conditions are pretty important.
have you ever studied the Sierra wave, the lenticulars over Lake Tahoe?
Uh, I have not studied them. I've definitely observed lenticulars here, not in the Sierras.
Well, directly over Carson City, there's something called the Sierra Wave. It's a great sailplane soaring site because the basin, the way the prevailing wind hits the mountains, it causes an oscillation of the airflow. So the initial mountain range causes a orographic lift. The air is deflected up at a sharp angle, goes into the basin, drops down really fast. I mean, vertically, just absolutely vertically. And then that upwelling bounces back up again on the downwind range and causes a wall of air for the air behind it. It runs into this upward deflected air, has to go somewhere, goes straight up. So they set sailplane soaring records here by capitalizing on this Sierra wave lift formation. But as an atmospheric phenomenon for studying the particles, it's ideal. I mean, it's incredible because here we've got something that is causing more or less the ultimate in vertical, without a thunderstorm present. It's the next best thing.
Sure, yeah.
So that's kind
That's
of
interesting.
And my thought was that these particulates, if subjected to that kind of upwelling, not only could they be altering their characteristics in such a way as we see with Kawasaki's disease, but this could change the rate of nucleation in such a way that it would scrub the air. In effect, it would cause all the crap, the volatiles, the acid rain, essentially, to form in one particular area and precipitate all the crap that it scrubs out of the air in one very small location.
I agree with you that, yeah, it's an interesting test case for looking at what can happen to particles that are directly lofted and maybe under conditions where you don't have this RH increase like you have with a thunderstorm, and rather it's going to get drier over there, that air going up and water more likely to precipitate out without having that uplift bringing up more moisture like you get in a thunderstorm. But you're wondering if it might be performing a useful service by removing stuff from the atmosphere in this region.
Or not so useful if you happen to be under it.
Yeah, I don't know how to think about that. So, yeah, what would you wish for as an atmosphere for atmospheric cleaning? I mean, you have really the best atmospheric cleaning is rain. You know, that's, if nothing, you know, the pollen fungal thunderstorm asthma stuff is the sort of weird exception where the storm is more generating problems in some ways rather than fixing them. But for any other kind of particle type, you know, smog, pollution, particles, whatever, I mean, it's rain that does the best job of clearing them out. So I would say, if you have this strong uplifting situation, orographic uplifting situation where you're not generating rainfall in general from that, you're gonna basically pack on you'll pack on whatever oxidizable stuff onto the particles that are there. They'll grow bigger. They'll coagulate into larger particles. Potentially, the bigger the particles are, the more easily they deposit out without rain. So yeah, potentially some effect there. And the bigger they are, the more difficult they are to breathe deep into your lungs. So yeah, I mean, on the whole, it might be, if you could pick whether you breathed air that came out of that outflow or not, maybe you would choose to. But I think probably, yeah, compared to raining out, nothing quite does the job like rain for clearing the atmosphere.
But if one were looking for examples of this effect of the atmosphere, the shape of the mountains, the local conditions, scrubbing something out of the air, and precipitating it on a certain geographic location, are there any easy clues that we could look at to tell us if such a thing is happening? And as it turns out, during this outbreak that I'm talking about, 1985, all the frogs disappeared. The frogs just absolutely vanished.
This is the
And
Kawasaki in
oh
Japan
well,
issue.
I think it's a similar, a parallel. But this happened in Lake Tahoe with the Lake Tahoe mystery illness,
Oh,
which
that,
is
yeah,
now
right,
called
gotcha. The incline
chronic fatigue
village.
syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was
Mm-hmm.
looking for environmental clues at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you see a whole bunch of people in a very small area getting sick, North Lake Tahoe, and you can't find any
Uh-huh.
logical explanation for it, but all of a sudden this
Uh-huh.
pollution swept over the mountains, I thought,
Mm-hmm.
well, given what I know, is it possible that something was concentrated out of the air of the San Joaquin Valley in a really spectacular way?
Mm-hmm.
And just at this exact time,
Uh-huh.
all the frogs really started suffering. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
the people studying frogs noticed this. They were extremely alarmed by this. And somebody actually did a study. They took healthy frogs from the Lassen area, brought them down to an environment in the Sierra Nevada mountains at Lake Tahoe, and the frogs all got sick and died. They took sick frogs up to the Mount Lassen area, and the frogs recovered.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
thought, wow,
Sounds.
that's testable. That tells us that something
Mm-hmm.
came in and it's getting even to the very tops of the mountains, something on the wind, your atmospheric shrapnel, whatever you want to call it, but something got precipitated here in this region that didn't happen elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if that
Yeah.
something fits the model for creating an illness in frogs, why not humans?
Is an interesting hypothesis. Yeah, to me, that sounds like it would need a um, almost like an atmospheric case study. Because when you tell me like about air, air tends to disperse, right? I mean, it's kind of rare to think of like some pocket of air, like for example, if it gets lofted really high, so if it gets lofted, it's going to have a tendency to dissipates, and it's not going to come down in one place most likely. So it's a so I think I would think of it differently than the sort of lofting hypothesis. But as far as, yeah, I guess what I would say, if your hypothesis is that you got a special case of San Joaquin Valley pollution in the Lake Tahoe area that drove this, I think you'd have to look at, well, maybe how frequently did that pollution, crest over in, over some time period? Did we get to a point where now it's happening with regularity and it didn't before, and like that was like the switch that turned, or was it like there was this one particular event that was, yeah, remarkable in some way, whether it be like the source regions it passed over in the valley, or the
Uh-oh, we cut out.
Sorry, did you guys lose me?
Yeah, last 15 seconds.
15 seconds. Oh yes. So I was just saying, my question would be, was it some really special atmospheric case um, that could have driven this, or did the air transportation transport times and conditions change like over time? Like, did you have like almost no events where this pollution got up, and all of a sudden you have more events? I think that would be the way I would try to start testing that hypothesis. It'd be, I mean, it'd be like
Well,
a sort of atmospheric reanalysis.
yeah, if there's different properties of nucleation at different altitudes, we'd have a stratification of this effect. So my working hypothesis is that up at the top of the pollution cloud, there was a stratification of this highly concentrated form of a particular type of nucleation that rained this type of toxic crap down on us. And that over time, as the pollution cloud got higher and the microbial ramifications of this toxin reverberating through the entire environment and upsetting all of our ecological balances, it sort of went back to an equilibrium where the toxic effect is not so pronounced, still here to a certain extent, but nothing like the sudden impact of when the pollution first crested the mountains.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis. It sounds difficult to test. I mean, I'm curious about so that seems like sort of like in the past, it would be difficult, almost difficult to find the answer. I mean, it sounds like study of, do you have measurements of like lake water quality over, X time, and do you have those like um, the transport, the atmospheric transport over time? I mean, that's kind of knowable.
Yeah, actually we do. Yeah, the Tahoe Environmental Research Center that monitors the lake quality, the algal blooms.
Mm-hmm.
They've been extremely concerned about this since that time. And they've been taking daily measurements. And interestingly enough, at the time, there was an intense clouding effect of the water. In fact, people were panic stricken about what was happening to the lake. The clarity was dropping so fast. They're going, within a short period of time, this is going to look like a green, mucky lake. And yet, a couple things have happened recently. Yeah, we've tried to reduce pollution as much as possible, but the lake clarity has stopped dropping, and the frogs are coming back. I've been watching the frogs all these weeks. I was very disturbed that our frogs disappeared, and I wondered, is this going to be permanent? Are we always, is it always? And no, thankfully, they are returning. So whatever happened, it's decreased.
Yeah, so
Now the researchers tell me that we can't go back in time. So even if you have some valid points, they won't even discuss it with me.
That is the problem. It's like it would be nice to know the answer to it. It could inform other things, but finding the answer, maybe they feel like it requires data that we don't have, and that could be the problem. I'm intrigued by your this Kawasaki syndrome. This is something this is like a repeated event that occurs. Okay, so that sounds like a place where science can help, as like atmospheric measurements could help if you know the source regions for the material and where the impacts are felt, and you can make observations in both places, then you might get somewhere. That's
In the
interesting.
National Geographic special, Strange Days on Planet Earth, they talked about the peculiar occurrence of respiratory diseases in the Caribbean, in Trinidad. I mean, formerly the best air anywhere on the planet, and these kinds of lung diseases were unknown. All of a sudden, the kids are coming down with asthma, and they have sick building syndrome, and they've had all kinds of problem with fungus.
Mm-hmm.
It's just taken off like a rocket. And they trace this back to the drying of Lake Chad in Africa.
Huh.
And this drying of the lake is putting African dust into the upper atmosphere, crossing the Atlantic. And where this dust rains down, it is causing fungal diseases and respiratory effects that are in excess of where this material comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that the coral is bleaching, the coral is dying, and testing of the health of the coral indicates, of all things, activated herpes viruses and fungal infections, such as one that they traced directly back to Lake Chad, Aspergillus sidawi. So they say we have a species of Aspergillus that came from Lake Chad, and we can genetically test this. And now this stuff is growing in the coral, and this seems to be associated with the increased fungal illness in Trinidad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Hmm. Crazy.
Yeah, so thanks to my interest in the upwelling of the atmosphere and the idea that something about moving the air up and then bringing it back down rapidly
Mm-hmm.
somehow makes it more pathogenic than where the material came from. This has been on my mind for a long time, so I've been collecting stories.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess I gave my 2 cents. I think breakup is plausible in at least some cases. I don't know, as far as transport, I mean, in the thunderstorm, it makes sense that things break up. You have updrafts into wet air, and then this osmotic pressure, fine. But this long range transport from Africa to Trinidad, what's going to happen? You'll have, I mean, I guess I don't know how moist that air is, maybe less so, and then transporting at elevation could be other processes but breakup I still think is still plausible, maybe not through the like too much water breakup, but yeah, whether it's breakup or
is it being reduced down to
oxidation.
nanoparticle form so it's more bioavailable?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting hypothesis. Yeah, plausible. Yeah.
I know I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, but basically that's what we do here at Exposing Mold. We're kicking around ideas, trying to think about all these strange things that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's cool. I always enjoy the kicking around ideas, opportunities. That's yeah, you think about things differently for sure if you do that.
Wait till Keely gets going. Then you'll really hear some bizarre stuff.
You don't want me to tell that story, do you?
So, we can save that for another time. I mean, you can only talk about crazy stuff for so long before.
Yeah, we're at the hour mark, and Michael, I got to say, this has been one of the best conversations that we've had. To hear this back and forth between two science-minded people, this has been really interesting. And thank you for engaging us on Eric's theory of the effect of part of what we think we see happening with the chronic nature and severe injury of mold illness. What he kind of walked you through was how he came to his theory based on the history and partially what he thinks is happening in the pathology of the illness. So this was a great discussion. Thank you for being so open-minded, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, thanks for having me. You gave me some things to think about as well, and yeah, I wish you guys luck in figuring out your puzzles.
Well,
And
we might, if we ever get research funding, I think we might enlist you as one of our researchers, because this has just been a really amazing conversation.
and as soon as you read about
Talk to
Kawasaki's disease, get back to us.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
All right.
If I have any insights, I will let you know.
Perfect. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
You too.